Welcome back to the Conquest of Happiness. In today's lecture, we're going to be covering yet another chapter in the larger section on causes of unhappiness. Today, we're going to be covering chapter 7, which Bertrand Russell originally named Sense of Sin, which I find a bit outdated. And in today's terminology, I've taken the liberties to retitle that Self-Loathing and Shame. When you're under the influence of this sense of sin, you have a consciousness that's racked full of guilt. And in his day, it might have been translated as, a preoccupation with feeling unworthy of God's love. And in today's contemporary situation, we might say a preoccupation with feeling defective, feeling unworthy of love, feeling inherently bad or damaged. Today we would associate this sense of sin with what is commonly talked about as negative self-talk. All right, so, a kind of commentary, a stream of commentary about how bad one is, how weak one is and vulnerable to temptations and bad habits and bad behavior. And when we feel this pervasive sense of guilt, shame, and sin, we're kind of living in this filter of negativity, and that kind of fog or filter of negativity is going to get in the way of going about the business of life, really. If you recall, in chapter 1, one of the main takeaways of the entire book appears there, and Bertrand Russell's going to make a powerful claim that narrow self-concern is the primary culprit of unhappiness. A kind of narrow self-concern that, it doesn't let us be involved in the things of the world with other people and our commitments in such a way that lets us flourish and lets us kind of get out of our own way. And so if we're thinking about ourselves as defective all the time, that's a particularly insidious, destructive form of narrow self-concern. So it's already problematic if we're concerned with ourselves too often. And this just takes it a step further. We're not only concerned about ourselves too much, but we're concerned with ourselves in ways that make us feel particularly bad. We are perseverating on our flaws, on our shortcomings, on ways we think we need to improve. And this narrow self-focus gets in the way, again, of healthy interest in life itself, healthy interest in things outside of yourself, in your engagements, hobbies, work, community projects, etc. From the work of Robert Firestone, who is a psychologist, author, and theorist, I particularly like drawing from his work in my clinical practice. He is still alive as of this filming. He's in his 80s. Some of the works that I've read came out in the 70s or 80s. He really has a lot of work on overcoming destructive cognition, overcoming negative self-talk. And he says that self-hate is the strongest human anti-therapeutic agent in existence. Its potential for destructive possibility is almost limitless. That's a bold claim, and Bertrand Russell would be in agreement with the fact that perseverating on oneself in hateful ways is pretty common and gets in the way of happiness. So if we were to distill some recommendations from the observations in this chapter and making them a little bit more contemporary, meaning translating some of the terms and ideas to fit better with the landscape of 2020. Bertrand Russell, I can imagine him saying, get acquainted with and comfortable with who you are, the full range of your human nature, and to not personalize the parts of our shared human nature that aren't noble, that aren't altruistic, that aren't in alignment with your highest spiritual purposes, right? Because human nature has both a lower, lesser self and a higher self. We have parts of ourselves that are more base. We have instincts and drives and hungers that come from our evolutionary past. That's sort of our more animal nature. And we also have, really amazing qualities like compassion and, a fight for social justice and kindness and cooperation that we might assign to our higher nature. Why it's important to get comfortable with the full range of our humanity is so that we don't suppress, deny, or hate on parts of ourselves that aren't in alignment with our social identity or our self-concept. That can create a division in oneself, and he'll note later that divisions in oneself are pernicious reasons for unhappiness, because when we're at war with ourselves, when we're conflicting with ourselves, we're losing a lot of energy in that fight, and we're not being able to be as fully constructive as we could be, channeling our energies in one direction, so to speak. Also, when we're doing that, when we're denying or fearful of or not ready to explore our lower selves, we put part of ourselves into hiding, and that's grounds for shame to breed when part of ourselves in hiding. And I think collectively we're getting a lot better at endorsing vulnerability. It's important to note that in acquainting with the full spectrum of our humanity, it doesn't necessarily mean like indulge all your impulses or run free with your lower self, because that's like who you are. And now that we're embracing who we are, we're just giving, again, free rein to our impulses by any means. It's important to work with ourselves, work with our instincts and hungers and drives and desires and fit into society. Have some kind of what's called ego adaptation to society. But rejecting that part of ourselves is not a really good starting ground to working with it effectively. It's a really unhealthy way to relate to ourselves if we're in denial about that part of ourselves or rejecting that part of ourselves. And fully embracing it, we can work with it more readily. Robert Firestone again clears this up by saying that he sees negative self-talk as completely distinct from a moral conscience or living by a set of values and moral attitudes. He sees negative self-talk that forms the negative self-concept as an unnatural overlay on the personality, a vicious manner of self-attack and castigation that he analyzes as originating in unhealthy early childhood environments. So accepting that you are far from being a saint, right, and that you have lower and higher parts of yourself is liberating, because it isn't heinous, like we're all on the same boat, and no one's talking about it, except Brené's trying to get us to all talk about it, which is fantastic. So accept your total humanity, grapple with all parts of yourself, And this is a long, usually lifelong process, but the point is to integrate ourselves. The point in self-development in general is to achieve a well-integrated personality, which again is usually the achievement of a lifetime. And what that means is, integrating our instincts with our aspirations. So even if it is sometimes important to call ourselves out or be called out for bad behavior, for example, and that's an important part of the functioning of interpersonal life and getting along with others and learning and growing together. It's destructive to dwell on your flaws and mistakes and shortcomings and imbalances and oversights and all the ways that we fall short of a perfectly integrated personality, right? Dwelling on that and beginning that process of self-loathing should be avoided. So I can imagine Bertrand Russell saying it this way with his very rational approach to life. He has a very rational mind and so a rational recipe for happiness. If you happen to find something wicked about yourself, or somebody calls out something that, is something that probably needs to be looked at and worked on, something that is unhealthy or incongruent with your values and the way you want to be, the way you generally hold yourself to be, you can do that, but do that neutrally, right? So just course correct, take in that feedback, assess if it is worthy of being listened to. Sometimes feedback isn't, or it comes from the wrong motivation, but if it's feedback that you really do need, it would be good to ingest, do so, but you don't need to do so with all this additional self-loathing. Take it in, course correct. You don't need to condemn yourself. And accepting that we're all flawed and emotionally imbalanced in about 10,000 ways helps us with this process, that nobody's perfect. Nobody is fully integrated, except, as I like to say to clients, maybe the Buddha. So we're all accepting we're not enlightened here. So, can we all accept feedback and course correct along the way? He says a little bit later on, nothing so much diminishes happiness as well as efficiency as a personality divided against itself. He thinks education, psychotherapy in today's world, psychoeducation, and self-help are effective methods for helping us achieve integration. Another recommendation that I can imagine Bertrand Russell saying, distilling the observations from this chapter, would be try not to have rigid ideologies or lofty expectations such that you can't really account for human nature as it is. We have to work with human nature rather than set ourselves up against some ridiculous idealism through which we are perennially falling short. This is a process that Bertrand Russell really recommends in order to free ourselves of oppressive ideologies, whether that be a religion or some of the mores that certain families endorse. Not everything is, not all institutions are healthy and life-affirming. Whether they're schools, churches, families, systems should be in adulthood examined for health. We take institutions that we were schooled in for granted at face value more. That's the way to say it. We take the advice given from these powerful institutions that we were under as children at face value. Bertrand Russell says we should not do that. That we should thoroughly examine the institutions through which we were raised and sort of cherry pick pieces that are healthy versus unhealthy and purge the toxic elements that we internalized from those institutions. So with your own rational mind, your own sources of intuition, your own inner knowing, examine the ideologies that are still in your programming that are causing you to feel bad about yourself, and get rid of the elements that are oppressing you. So ask yourself, what is truly immoral? What is truly ineffective? How do I want to live? And, if there are sort of taboos that you are still feeling guilty in the face of, that are irrational or make no sense, or preserved some of that dysfunction in the institutions that you were raised in, get rid of it. You have the power to do that now. I think this is really empowering. So basically, you shouldn't have a guilty conscience over things you shouldn't be guilty of. So again, this comes from the realization that perhaps what you were taught, especially in terms of who to be and how to act, you might have been taught things by unhealthy or even toxic people. For example, you might have internalized that you shouldn't have feelings, or you shouldn't be yourself, or you shouldn't express yourself, or you shouldn't assert yourself. These are common inhibitions that people have to work out of if they are to attain psychological health. In some of our ways that we are self-denying and self-sacrificing and inhibited in this way comes from dysfunctional family systems that, again, Robert Firestone analyzes as family systems that want to preserve their own wants and needs. Those in power, usually the caregivers, imprinting their children with suppressing their own needs. So this is an empowerment to find your own personal standards and to try to live by them. And if you fail them, that you can give yourself compassion for trying to attain some of these personally crafted ideals, that it's a process. Distilled in another way, we might say that if you're living under the tyranny of psychic oppression, reprogram yourself. Take control of that programming and cultivate it into something that is more life-affirming and self-supportive rather than self-condemning. And lastly, as we say, stop shooting on yourself. Stop shooting on yourself. I want you to pair this visual, this pile of poo, with shooting on yourself. And it's the same level of, it's like a toxic dump that you're doing on yourself. You're performing this toxic dump on yourself. You're generating this pile of poo when you shoot on yourself. So catch yourself when you're shooting on yourself. Be really vigilant about the use of that term.